EOYDC is proud to present Navigating the Dual Pandemics of COVID-19 and Systemic Racism. The presenters for today are myself, Regina Jackson, President and CEO for the past 27 years, Landon Hill, an EOYDC alum, who is the Director of Program Effectiveness, and Selena Wilson, also a program alum, who serves as Vice President of Organizational Effectiveness. Together, we have almost 50 years of service in youth development.
So as our President and CEO, Ms. Regina Jackson stated, we're so thrilled to be with you today. We want to welcome you and just tell you a little bit more about the East Oakland Youth Development Center. We visualize a community of empowered youth and young adults who have the character, skills, and network to positively contribute to society. Landon and I are both great examples of how our mission comes to bear, which is to develop the social and leadership capacities of youth and young adults all the way from age 5 to 24, so that they're prepared for employment, higher education, and leadership opportunities. So next up, I want to talk a little bit about the objectives of today's session, which are to explore further the intersection between how the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism impacted our community and how community-based organizations can be responsive. We also want to explore how EOYDC was able to modify programming to be virtual and social distance friendly, in-person options in alignment with CDC guidelines. So we'll be sharing our experience with the hope that it can help you understand how to make these sort of modifications if you're running a similar sort of community-based organization. Next up, I'm going to turn it over to Landon to talk a little bit more about the impact of COVID-19 on our community.
Sure. So just to ground us in the work, the map that you're looking at shows the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 within Oakland. And as you see, the area that's circled, those are two of the most impacted zip codes, the 94621 zip code being the one where EOYDC is located, and both of those zip codes representing the areas where most of our families actually live. And so due to the impact that has had, and as you even look at some of the other surrounding communities where a number of our other families come from, we recognize the need to really step up to be able to support. And so when we were thinking about that, of course, the first and foremost, we're thinking about our students, our families who live in these areas. We're also considering our staff members, many of which have kids, needed assistance with daycare, needed to be able to do schooling from home, things of that nature. But then also, we've always prided ourselves on recognizing that during these times, we support the community at large. And so stepping outside of just the building to do as much as we can to be able to lift up and support all those who were trying to navigate this difficult time.
Yes, and one of the things that I'll add, when we talk about the dual pandemics of systemic racism and COVID-19, it's important to understand that the map that we showed, the families that we serve and our staff are largely comprised of Black families, Black and Brown families. And so we're really mindful of the fact that our communities are hit the hardest by this pandemic because of systemic racism. So there were a number of ways in which we were able to shift our operations in order to support staff. Starting in mid-March, when shelter in place was instituted across the Bay Area and the state, we immediately shifted operations to support remote work, as well as remote programming options, which Landon will talk about further. We, for example, extended our 4-week paid caregiver leave to staff with young school-age children. So every single staff member was able to take leave if they wanted to with full payment. We also created flexible remote work schedules and specific work plans for each team member to ensure that their hours were not reduced. We're really proud to say that we were able to retain staff 100%. We did not have any furloughs or any pay cuts. We also offered staff stipends to reimburse the use of their personal cell phones and internet while working remotely, and distributed supplies and equipment in order to support their work from home, in addition to PPE for their personal use as well as the use of their families. In order to make sure the staff continue to feel a sense of connection and groundedness as an EOYDC family, we held weekly Zoom staff meetings and included a wellness component each week, just so that we could make sure that our staff are taking care of ourselves. To the right, you'll see a beautiful picture of many of our EOYDC team members showing off our face mask challenge to encourage our community members to wear their masks when out and about. I'm going to turn it over to Landon to talk about our shift to virtual programming during this time.
Yeah, so when mid-March, I believe it was March 16th was the first Monday, somewhere around there, that we went from being in person to online programming. And so we recognized again that as students were trying to figure out, and families and parents were trying to figure out exactly what they were going to do to support their kids while at home, we switched to having a number of different offerings online. And so we had live readings that we offered. We also had a number of different activities that students were able to participate in and parents were able to access. We also were able to distribute a number of home supply kits. So people, again, mentioning wanting to serve and reach outside of our immediate families that we serve. People from the community could come to pick up homeschool kits and PPE supplies to be able to make sure that their homes were well taken care of and stocked. And then we also were able to provide some financial support through various grants that we'll talk about a little bit later on to ensure that parents who maybe were off of work, were laid off, et cetera, were able to hopefully sustain themselves throughout the time. And then we also hosted what we call Party with a Purpose. And so we were able to hear from especially many of our young people about how they were navigating these times, both in terms of the pandemic, but then also as there was an upsurge in many of the demonstrations to the police brutality and violence that was happening, how all of this was impacting them, and to be able to hold many of these important conversations, some of which you heard earlier today from our speaker. And so we were able to use all of our resources and our dedicated staff time to be able to really provide these different offerings to all of our students and families.
Now I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Regina Jackson to talk about funding strategies during this time.
Thank you very much, Selena and Landon. So early on, I think that we were just kind of stunned at how much the pivot was going to affect us. So rather immediately, I reached out to all of our funders in a basic email saying, hey, we're out here and we could use some conversation and some flexibility in terms of the kinds of support that might be offered. And so many funders were able to meet us right in the middle, even giving us funding based upon conversations and not even having to put together proposals. And others were flexible around us being able to provide support to families inside our communities. Next, one thing that was really important was to nail down our payroll pledge program. And we had worked with two different entities that got us nowhere. And then lo and behold, Ascend BLO delivered. They connected us with the third entity, LISC, that would actually help us successfully navigate this process, which was a serious process, but they held our hand right through to conclusion. I'd like to say that Ascend also pivoted their own focus, and they began to identify new funders and manipulate some of their own relationships to introduce many of our organizations to new possibilities. One such entity we obviously love is the Akinadi Foundation, and we really appreciated the Ascend program for showing us just how much muscle they had in the development space. In addition, as we got to about, I want to say almost the George Floyd scenario, we were able to many of our funders around their desire to support social justice, racial justice. And one of the things that might not be listed in our mission or our vision, but is certainly threaded throughout all of our programming, is positive identity formation or racial pride. Much like character-based leadership and trauma-informed care, the importance of having our students, Black and Brown, proud of their culture and their heritage, and especially looking at Oakland as a place that has helped to birth some of our greatest advocates for identity formation. Many of those funders got right on board and were exceptionally very much appreciative for that.
Thank you. And thank you, Byron, for the shout out. We definitely appreciate that. Reopening strategy, Landon's going to talk a little bit about our summer program pilot for social distance friendly in-person programming.
Sure. So even though we felt and found that we had a lot of success with our online offerings, and that many of our families were really appreciative for what it was that we were able to provide and the things that they were able to access, we recognized that there was still no replacing being in person, and especially as the pandemic went on, and either many of our parents being essential workers or just needing to report back to work for one reason or another, we recognized that we needed to be able to have some space, some safe space for our students to come. And so we actually launched our 5-week summer program. It's usually 6 weeks. It's usually known as our Summer Cultural Enrichment Program, but we changed it this year, called it Summer Remix, because we recognized that we weren't going to be able to maintain all of the elements that we typically have, but we were able to still make as much use of our space as possible. And so we were able to still hold our K-8 programming on site, as opposed to having, upwards of 20 students, 15 to 20 students in a room at a time. We limited the number of students to 5 to 7 with the support of some of our youth interns. Selena, we also, I mentioned here, we also had our youth interns to be able to support with the programming for our young people. And then we also, of course, had our adult staff that was on site to be able to ensure that all of our young people, both the participants and our youth leaders, were maintaining social distancing protocols, that we were sanitizing properly, that we were doing everything that we could to ensure that our young people were having fun, but also being safe. And then all of our students, as opposed to being having full day programming, we limited to half day, just to minimize the exposure to students being in the building, and to also allow for us to maximize the number of students that we could serve. And so essentially what we did is that students were coming either on a Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Thursday rotation. For half days, we were able to have some students come for essentially AM programming, and then a second group of students come in for PM programming. And that allowed for us to hold many more students than we would have had we held it all day. Also was able to help us to minimize the amount of time that they were in the building and give us time to properly prepare, clean, as people were coming back into the building. And then we, of course, as I mentioned earlier, prioritize those students who are kids of essential workers, or those who were just needed to report back to work. It's because they didn't have many other places for them to go during the summer. And then we finally just hired a janitorial staff. And so although we typically would have programming Monday through Friday, we did reduce it to Thursdays, to Monday through Thursday, so that on Fridays we could do a deep clean and ensure that that a janitorial staff that we hired outside of our regular facilities team was able to do the cleaning from the entire week. And so although we would love to have our students in as much as possible, we also recognize that their safety was number one. And so we decided to limit the amount of programming time in order to ensure that we limited their exposure to any germs or the virus or anything of that nature.
Thank you, Landon. And we're excited to share that after the 5-week pilot, we had no incidents of COVID-19. We were able to successfully serve nearly 90 children and over 125 high school and college age students through our hybrid approach for that age group. One of the ways we were able to be successful in launching this pilot program while having no incidents of COVID-19 were very, very strict safety guidelines. And we'll be reviewing some of those key safety guidelines today. We'll also be sharing a learning brief that summarizes these through post-read materials. So one thing that we did was require mandatory COVID testing for all staff and interns before they were able to return to on-site activities, and also ensured that there were rigorous ongoing staff trainings on safety guidelines, everything from how to wash your hands properly, how to disinfect properly, how to wear a mask properly, so forth and so on. We also had all sign in and out by parents and caregivers conducted outside of the building so that no one but staff and participants were allowed in the building during program hours. That included parents. So parents were only outdoors, and we would bring their children to them at the end of the day and bring them in at the beginning of the day. We also had daily health screening questions and temperature checks using a forehead thermometer for everyone before entering the building. And as Landon mentioned, making sure that each class was structured so there were no more than 10 people in a room at a time, seated at least 6 feet apart. We also redesigned our programming completely to limit crossover between groups. So normally we have instructors who will teach a specific subject. What we did this time is we had the instructors share lesson plans with one another so that there could be a single instructor with a particular group. We also, of course, very important, made sure there were regular hand washing and sanitizing protocols scheduled throughout the day, and also provided participants with their own individual activity kits. So children did not share things like scissors and markers and crayons. They had their own supply kit every day with their name on it that was disinfected daily to decrease the spread of germs. We also made sure that meals and snacks were eaten outside with social distancing, and ensured that everyone wore a mask properly inside of the building. One practice that we advise is that for these sort of programs, what we did is provide a fresh surgical or N95 mask daily to staff and students. This way we could ensure that everything had proper filtration. We didn't have to worry about whether masks were sanitized or not. We had a fresh, clean, new mask daily. A few additional guidelines that we implemented that we think are important to note, making sure that we educated parents and caregivers about risk mitigation so that they could be practicing similar things at home. So talking about how you properly wear a mask, talking about the importance of checking for symptoms before you leave the home and things like that. Making sure that we planned activities that didn't require close physical contact. So there were a number of activities that we either didn't do this summer that we would normally do, or redesigned completely to be social distance friendly. We also, again, made sure that all materials, we had separate set of materials for staff and participants, minimized the time that people might spend standing in lines, and making sure that there were social distancing in those places. This might sound small, but this is an important thing to remember. We taped off all of the water fountains and made sure that our kids had fresh water bottles daily. Again, to decrease the risk of germ spread, and also removed any toys that might be difficult to clean or disinfect. Classroom ventilation is really key. So what we were able to do was work with our air systems vendor to make sure we upgraded our filtration system to the highest level of filtration, also opening windows and propping doors as much as possible to get fresh air in. Also ensuring that personal items that kids may bring are kept on their person, making sure that little things, again, that might be easy to take for granted, eliminating lost and found, because that is a germ breeder, right? So little things like this are what we want to kind of call to the attention of our youth development colleagues. And then lastly, making sure that staff are getting tested monthly. And so at the beginning of the pilot, we had staff tested. At the end of the pilot, we had staff tested, and have them continuing to get tested monthly, as well as following special circumstances. So if there's air travel, if there is any mass gathering events that they attend, we make sure that they are tested. And then lastly, avoid gathering in common areas. That was a lot. And again, we will be sharing a learning brief to really share those lessons learned in a way that folks can mull over and share among your networks. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Regina to talk about our virtual graduation.
Hello. We were really challenged this year around trying to find a way to do our scholarship fundraiser and acknowledge the outstanding accomplishments of our students, high school, college, and graduate students who are graduating. And we made a full pivot to a hybrid virtual, and we didn't do the folks that we normally celebrate as champions for youth. But having said that, what we recognize is, particularly in the midst of COVID, our young people are going through anxiety and depression and isolation, and much of the PTSD or just trauma that they are surrounded by. And so we wanted to make sure that we took this time to celebrate them. We had a safe distancing pre-production part of the programming so people could actually come in and be on camera and talk about their accomplishments, and then later thread it together for an actual presentation. We are happy to include that link along with the post documents and media and learning brief that we will share. And we were just really delighted to include videos from some of our favorite folks. Yes, the Warriors and Marshawn, but also some of our outstanding sponsors. And we were really excited from Mr. Charlie Couric, who made a donation of $45,000, which meant that our scholarships that we distributed were over $100,000. So that was really, really big. The kids were so appreciative, and certainly there were a lot of tears and a lot of wonderful comments from parents as well.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to turn over back to Landon to talk about our fall programming.
Yeah, so first I just want to say we've been trying to monitor the chat as much as possible, and so we've seen all the comments, and thank you all very much for those. In terms of fall programming, so we realized that obviously coming into the school year, there were going to be some new challenges that even the summer hadn't brought, especially with students having to go into distance learning full time. Although last at the end of the spring semester, when COVID hit, where things weren't really planned out and we weren't really knowing what to expect in terms of how schools are going to respond and things of that nature, we were a little bit more prepared, but we knew that students were going to be on their having to log in on their laptops or tablets or things of that nature in order to actually do school. And so we again had to make a really hard decision. During the summer, we had to limit the number of days that students were able to come in and adjust our programming a lot. During the school year, though, during this fall, although we typically operate after school, we not only opened up all day, but instead of doing that half day and every other day rotation, what we ended up doing is having the same students come every day so that we could support them more deeply. And so although we of course wanted to be able to serve as many students as possible, we recognized that doing half day wasn't feasible because some students were gonna and then we also were going to be able to really make sure that we could help students log into their classes as needed, support with their homework as needed, et cetera. And so we made the hard decision to limit the number of students that we had come in. We have about 35 to 36 students per day that come in. And so what we do is that we allow for them to enter the building. They still do their screenings and their checks as we did during the summer. And then each student, we have the schedule, their school schedules for the day. At the times that they're supposed to log in, they'll log into their classes with the assistance of our youth interns for our K-5 students, and then our adult staff for our middle school students. They are usually in class anywhere from 8:30 to about 2:30, 3 o'clock, depending upon their schedule, and then they still will participate in their other both academic and wellness activities that we offer up until 5 p.m. And so although our schedule has traditionally been from 3 to 6 p.m. In terms of our programming, we've opened that up quite a bit to be able to support all day. We do have as I mentioned, we have the same group of students that come in daily. And so we're able to work with them a little bit more closely, ensuring that we know exactly kind of what's going on. We're able to communicate with our parents more regularly about the school schedules. We've had students already who have changed schools, whose schedules have changed, but we've been able to stay on top of that much more than we likely would have been able to had we had more turnover as we did during the summer. And then we are also going back to integrating some more of our wellness activities that we paused during the summertime, especially again when we weren't really sure when we were still trying to get information about how the virus worked and trying to be as cautious as possible. We did recognize and just make sure that we had all the resources that we needed. We're now in a position to be able to ensure that students have their own, just like they have their own individual kits. As we introduce things like basketball back, have their own individual basketballs that they can play with, maintaining the social distancing within a large space like our gym, but be able to still get that exercise that's really important that we weren't able to facilitate nearly as much during the summertime. And so we're constantly keeping up with any of the updates as it pertains to how the virus is spreading, but also wanting to ensure that and recognizing the importance of making sure that our students are in schools, in their classes at all times and supporting them there, but also getting any of the enrichment and wellness activities that they need to get their energy out so that they could be most effective. And so we made those pivots during the school year or for the school year to make sure that we can meet their needs as best as possible.
Thank you, Landon. I'm going to turn it back to Ms. Regina to talk about some of our community support.
So I want to give a shout out to Deborah Watkins. Thank you for your comments in the chat. And it might actually be really helpful for those of you who have questions to go ahead and put them in the chat, and then hopefully we can move more expeditiously in responding. But as Landon and Selena had mentioned before, it's not enough to guide and navigate your own organization towards success in COVID-19. It is exceedingly important, particularly for those of you who are successful in fundraising and have an outstanding brand, to reach out and touch many of the other smaller organizations that may need a hand up, and or to partner with getting messages out when you have a large following. So in terms of the community support and partnership that we participated in, you'll see a picture there for promoting the program Mask Up, and that was through the Alameda County Public Health Agency. We had an early opportunity from the city of Oakland to be a re-grantor, and we're able to identify East Oakland organizations that were on the ground fighting COVID in its most exceptional way, and we were able to negotiate with them to increase that grant from $100,000 to $250,000, and it really helped where it was necessary. In addition to that, we, as a part of the Black Cultural Zone, we quality of life work groups, which brought about the Voices campaign and ultimately the People's Briefing, which is a medical focus, keeping everybody up to date on a weekly basis of what's going on. And then finally, our own Selena Wilson was a moderator for a COVID-19 unity group, and that event actually shared many best practices, both in the medical and social service field. So we're just really proud to be able to share the expertise and the capacity of our leadership staff to help benefit those folks that we love working with and who at critical times may need our support even more.
Thank you. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of systemic racism on policing, again, as we're thinking about the dual pandemic that we're facing.
So with respect to this, I, as a community leader, was always worried about the safety of our young people. And it's for that reason and that reason alone that I sought out an appointment on the police commission, so that I might be able to have some impact on training and policy work. We know that with COVID-19, systemic racism, they just kind of feed off of each other, and the people that lose are African Americans primarily, and then secondarily people of color. So some of the pop-ups are not going to be news to you. But what I want to frame is that The city of Oakland has a race and equity problem. A report that was produced in 2017 gave the city an F for failure. In terms of racial profiling, there was a 1 point out of 100. So we can go ahead and add to the illustrations, but the point being that racism is pervasive. It is in our municipalities, it's in our communities, and it's in all of our systems. And the only way that we can change them is through organizing and advocacy. So when we look at like the asphyxia piece toward the end of the top of the slide, we've just come out with a special order against using asphyxia protocols that the city council will be ruling on or hopefully supporting soon. But the point is that at the top of every disproportionate policing entity is African Americans. We are killed the most. We are arrested the most. We are disproportionately harmed the most. Now, this may be true in the city of Oakland and certainly in the Bay Area, but we also know that it's also an extraordinary issue nationwide. And while we have a very committed group of folks on the police commission trying to identify protocols, training, and policies to eradicate our own statistics at home, we continue to need support in the way of advocacy and the way of understanding that, you know, police are doing just what they were trained to do. And until we change that narrative, we will continue to have these problems. So in terms of East Oakland Youth Development Center, all along we have had advocacy kinds of initiatives, specifically called, one is specifically called Rise Up. It's both an art and history initiative that again speaks to positive identity formation, traces time back to advocacy groups like the Black Panthers and civil rights. And we each year are demonstrating and teaching our young people to lift their voices, to advocate for themselves and their lives. We've even taken this on the road to the March on Washington. It wasn't just the March on Washington, but it was the March for Our Lives, where young people were activated to visit Washington, D.C., to meet with Congresswoman Lee on their suggestions for changing issues around policing and safety guidelines. And, you know, it's a part of our daily work. It is threaded through everything that we do in the programs. And you will get in a post email some video footage that focuses on a few slices of the information that we're sharing here today. And you'll see Steph and Aisha Curry at a march that some of our alumni organized. You can go ahead, Selena. So one of the really important things that I'd like to share for organizations and individuals alike is the importance of telling your story. Telling your story is a grounding demonstrative protocol for being able to raise funding. The more clear the story is, the more enticing it will be. And so on the left, there is a picture of the East Oakland Youth Development Center, and it talks about Black Pride. Unfortunately, this platform did not allow us to get the best audio, so we decided that we'll send it to you later. The Dave Youth Stories, there's nothing like having an extraordinary following of alumni, especially when they decide to be journalists. So J.R. Valerie produced two articles on our work, both focusing on our summer approach dealing with COVID-19 and the quality programs that we did, as well as moving into fall. And then on the top right, there's an NBC news piece called Race in America, where in my police commission hat, we really talked about the importance of action steps. There's a lot of talk that goes on, but until you actually change the work, change the narrative, change the accountability, you change nothing. And then the final piece is the ABC News piece that focused on, through programming, how we build Black pride in our young people, how we model it, how we give them activities to support it, and how we actually see it demonstrated in our alums. They're always listening. So never forget learn how to tell your story, get your elevator pitch together, identify and take many pictures so that there are a variety of ways for you to be able to justify to funders and to followers that the work that you're doing is important and that you need money to support it.
All right, so thank you all so much. We have a few minutes left and we want to take your questions. And so we are going to take a look at the questions that we already have in the chat and answer them there. And so I see over here, we have a question from Byron about what we're seeing in terms of mental health, PTSD, and trauma needs in students. So that's a great question. One of our focal points for the past several years has been trauma-informed care and healing-centered approaches. And I'll talk a little bit about this, and I'd love for my colleagues to weigh in. But you know, it's as Ms. Regina mentioned, we're seeing a lot of latent kind of signs of depression and anxiety in a lot of our young people, which makes sense. This is an unprecedented time for us all, but we understand that for young people, their brains aren't fully developed. The part of their brains that deals with reasoning, particularly trying to make sense out of things that are so conceptually tough to make sense out of, it's not fully there, right? So we have to help them make sense out of a time where it's really difficult to make sense out of a whole pandemic, giving them space to express themselves, particularly around racial injustice and police brutality with our teens, particularly our young Black men who were really struggling with the trauma of seeing folks that look like them continuously have their lives taken or cut short. So we're definitely seeing the trauma, and we're also definitely seeing a lot of resilience and ways in which as a community we can really make sure that we're providing space for healing. Mr. Regina and Landon, do you have some other thoughts on that?
Yes, so during this time, we have certainly heard about a few, fortunately for us, unsuccessful attempts at suicide. I was just on a call yesterday where I was recommending resilience coaching. We are now getting ready to facilitate healing circles. One reason that it came up was a recent death by extraordinary accident. But the real deal is that the majority of our adolescents have been relegated to Zoom, and they need a place and they need a safe space to feel what they're feeling out loud. One of the problems that we saw in the parties with purpose in terms of COVID-19 is that, you know, people are pretty much stuck in their rooms if in fact they have rooms. We received quite a few calls right as the pandemic began from our students who were being ejected from college campuses because campuses were just kind of shutting down. They weren't being refunded on food or dorm fees or anything. They just had a week to pack up and go. And for some of ours who are housing insecure in their normal life, dorms provided the consistency of a home life that they hadn't had. And so their lives were really turned upside down. And so we created an emergency fund to provide some support. We even facilitated air flights home and tried to find housing for them. Just imagine this on top of trying to keep up with your studies, you know, losing your jobs because they, you know, employers decided to just stop internships or stop job offers. You know, our young people are resilient, but the multi-layered trauma on top of this horrific virus and losing, you know, adults and family is just, it's a pervasive, it's a evolving kind of trauma that I don't know how we get out of. And, you know, our commitment to our young people, you know, and trying to also keep our own staff healthy, it is an ongoing challenge. So communication is key. We have been referring to therapists. We have become the certified therapists. We've had a couple of young people demonstrate bipolar disorder, and this is the age 17 to 24 when it begins to show up, and trying to support our families through it. So it's been one big hot mess. I will say that I am so very proud of my and Bent over as much as they possibly can during this time. I couldn't be more proud with the way in which they've shown up very selflessly. So Landon, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I was actually sharing and responding to Rachel's comment in the chat, so I'll finish up in just a moment. But especially for some of our youngest participants, obviously just the challenge of having to do schooling online has been difficult. But one of the things that we noticed even as early as the summertime was that because we had to limit the number of students that were in a room, the energy was just affected and impacted by that. And so, the livelihood that we saw from a number of students, although they weren't sad, you can feel the impact of not being able to really engage with each other in the ways that they're used to. And not just in terms of talking with one another, but being able to be in close proximity with one another, right? And to be able to share with each other in the ways they're used to, both for our elementary school students, but also our middle school students. And that's been one of the things that we have been constantly working on, is how do we make sure that we are able to ensure that they are engaging with each other, sharing with one another, being able to continue to form those meaningful relationships while still being safe, and being able to be as distant as possible. But we saw that very early on, even in our pilot, to see just how being isolated, even within the same room, much less not being in the space at all, can drastically impact how they're showing up. We've also just had a number of students who have, as both Mr. Gina and Selena talked about and mentioned, isolation, and feeling isolated, especially for many of our high school students who may not have the spaces to come, like EOYDC, to be to share with one another. And so we are constantly, again, finding ways to be able to reach out and touch base with them, and also just ensuring that some of our young people just still aren't fully aware of what this means, especially some of our youngest participants. And so trying to stress the importance of staying safe while also not trying to scare them, right? Because for a lot of young people, this can also be just a very scary time. And hearing things on the news that they aren't really fully able to conceptualize. We are in a space of wanting to make sure that we don't traumatize them, right, with some of the realities, but also making sure that they are aware of why it is that we need to be as safe as possible. And so it's been, that has been one of the struggles that I think we've been doing a pretty good job at, as best as we can, to be able to really ensure that our young people are fully aware as much as they can be, while still also being able to still be kids. And I think that the pandemic and having the social distance has taken some of that away. And so while we're on site, we're doing what we can to be able to add that element back, because for many parents outside of here, they're still not going anywhere. They're still not doing anything. People still aren't able to see their friends. They're in new classes with new faces who they haven't seen before. They're with new teachers who they've never met before. And so they have all of this new exposure, but not the connection that they're used to. And one of the things that we've typically done really well at is being able to form those meaningful connections, but we're having to still kind of re-envision what that looks like.
And to the young woman that was in the chat who referenced West Africa, DM me on LinkedIn. On our profiles, we have contact information. And if you can't do that, then go to the organizers. They know how to reach me.
Yeah, and I also put the three of our email addresses in the chat box, but it is our first names at EOYDC.org. The last thing I'll add before I know we need to return, just in being mindful of how we can be trauma responsive, is that kids still need to have fun. And so finding ways to make sure that in this very heavy moment, kids can be kids and have lighthearted moments is very important. And I know many of us are very concerned about learning loss and making sure that kids are not getting behind academically. And yet it's still very important that we find ways for them to have fun and have lightness in their spirit. And when I say kids, I mean our teens too. Like, let's think about it. All of the fun things about high school are gone. Prom's gone, homecoming's gone, all the fun things are gone, and all of the things that are hard are still there. Still gotta take your tests, still have to do your homework. And so while our Pathway to College program is normally very academically focused, we're trying to find ways for them to have fun, doing makeup tutorials, doing exercise challenges, doing social media challenges, and recognizing that they're still young people and they still need to have fun. And so I really encourage folks in youth development to, in addition to thinking about health and wellness and academics, really thinking about how can they have fun still in a safe way.
So with all of that, we are delighted to have been able to engage you. If there are other questions, please send them directly to us. This is the East Oakland Youth Development Center. Our alumni are our executives here. Just shows you the outstanding character that we're able to model and expose, and what we will rely on very soon. Thank you so much on behalf of myself, Selena, and Landon.